Hello everybody. It is that time again. And I know I've been bad. I haven't actually got the other set of videos out already. So, you'll see a huge backlog. Unfortunately, I keep forgetting every night to do it. In fact, I keep forgetting to do anything right before I go to sleep the last couple of nights. And if you can't quite tell, it's wonderfully dewy this morning. Just covering my window. I can still see, even with a few streaks of water across it though, so we're all good. And I meant to turn earlier. Well, heck, we'll go the other way. I hate this rise. Now, this morning here, I did find one news article which is going to get me into rant mode this morning, which is the City of London Police. And the City of London is not London the city, is probably the best way to describe that. The City of London is a small little sort of almost pseudo-nation within the city that we call London, which is why it's so confusing to actually say it by name. It existed there since Roman times, and the city that we call London developed around the City of London proper over time. And the two aren't really related. In fact, they have very little in common, even governmentally, with the rest of the nation. A series of guilds and corporations are the only entities that matter within the City of London. Basically, the only way you can even live there as a citizen proper, is if you happen to be a member of either one of these guilds that have existed since medieval times, or you're part of a corporation which has an office within the small little, I believe it's 1 mile square area that actually encompasses the City of London. And in fact, they are the only ones that can vote. They all get, I won't describe the whole political structure. There are other videos you can watch online. In fact, there's a good series by, I think it's CG Gray or CP Gray, for the person's username, that does a lot of different educational videos in a kind of funny vein. A lot of animation work to them. And he does an entire couple of videos covering the subject of the City of London. So, probably easier for you guys to go there than for me to describe it. But basically, to sum it up, big businesses are the ones that run effectively the City of London. Not London the city. And they have their own police force, which, like any police force, basically does whatever its government wants. Though, ironically, its police force is made up of people who aren't going to be ones that live in the City of London. mean, that sort of sometimes happens around here. Someone who doesn't live in the city proper will actually be working for the city as a police officer, but that's a little more understandable when it's less like a country and more like a city. When you have your own government, I think that kind of steps up the level a little bit. That is, well, I should say own government that is different than the one that you're actually a part of. They're not democratic in any sane sense of that word, unless you think a government run by corporations and guilds is a democratic government. I tend to vote no on that one. But they are part of the whole of the United Kingdom. If people in the UK actually even want to call it that anymore. They don't seem terribly united most of the time. I just noticed the camera's all out of whack, so let's see if that helps a little. But, yeah, their police just recently, I believe yesterday night, we're talking again about how we need to increase intellectual property laws. And by that, they mostly mean copyrights. Copyright is the big one for most companies right now. Mostly because they've managed to force it open so wide that copyright almost means nothing at this point, other than as a means to keep anyone ever from using anything that they figure has value. And by that, I mean that the original purpose of copyright, and this is what I'm going to be ranting about, is copyright in general. Not so much the article, but the article just basically speaks to why I want to do this. But the original intent of copyright was to give, for a short period of time, the ability for a creative person to attempt to earn some sort of profit from their creative works. Authors were, and probably still are, one of the bigger ones that want copyright. Originally they wanted copyrights, which started in the UK, ironically enough, because a lot of printing places were just printing copies of their books without any authors getting any money for them. So, like, an author would do an initial run of a book, and especially at the time they were doing this, that would be like a couple hundred copies. Well, if people liked that, other printing places would soon be pumping out hundreds more of that same thing. But at that point in time, they didn't give anything back to the writer who created the work in the first place. That made for a lot of pretty much poor writers, just eking out a living whenever they could. And enough of them managed to get together with enough political force behind them that they created the original copyright laws. The original copyrights gave, for only a handful of years, the ability to take anyone to court and claim damages if they infringed on the copyright of whatever work of art they had created. Like I said, originally this was about books, but copyright also applies to photography, which didn't exist back then. Painting, sculpture, today, even software is copyrightable. I'm trying to think of some of the other categories, and they're not coming to me because it's too early in the morning. But you get... music. Music is the other one. I almost had forgotten. Wow. Movies also fall in there as well. In fact, this wave of issues with copyright started mostly because of the music and... this guy keeps slowing down on every hill. Learn to accelerate, hopefully before the damn hill. Okay, anyways. The recent round of copyright stuff really coming up in the news was due to the movie and music industries, which had started to sue individuals rather than just, people redistributing their work for profit, like the old printing presses had. Well, I shouldn't say printing presses. The press did not infringe on copyright. What infringed on copyright were the places using those printing presses, which back then were printing houses, generally. But, yeah, that's where it all started. They had, for a long time, worked on what could best be described as a patron model, which is that some wealthy, usually aristocrats, or in some cases merchant, would hire them to write either whatever they felt like or pieces that benefited them in some way. And that's at least how one aspect of creative works happened, was using this patron model. That happened for music, that happened for paintings, that happened for writing. Now, that's completely different from the average person who could create like a small story within a context of their friends and acquaintances. And that's not how, for instance, bards would work. And by that I don't mean the bard Shakespeare, I mean bards in general, which his title gets its name from. Oh, and here's that bridge that's out that you can finally see from this direction. This is the way I would usually come, well, not this road, because this is the detour, but that road, if we had kept going straight through the construction zone, which is not a thing you can do right now. And as you can tell by the guy in front of me that I'd like to get around anyways, there are other ways of going around this. I don't know the routes if you go left. I only know the ones if you go right. I'm pretty sure it involves a dirt road when you go left, though, and I'd just as soon avoid that. But back to copyright. Most bards were, more or less average common citizens. They weren't aristocrats. Some would eventually go on to expand into other things, like writing actual books or plays or things along that line in general. But most were just common people that worked in places like taverns and were entertainment, telling stories, playing music, a whole variety of what they would have called lowbrow art, and because of copyrights, that sort of stuff ended up being copyrighted as well. It wouldn't happen quite yet if you're looking at it historically, because we just historically started copyright. But within a fairly short time, to make the process easier, everything that was creative that we created, we now have copyright on. So, like, if you created a new story, there's some work involved to prove when you created it, but beyond that, as soon as you create a work of art, it is considered yours and you have the copyright on it without having to file any claims or do anything specifically. Big corporations go the extra effort to prove exactly when something was copyrighted to them. That's good. Yeah, go down the middle of the road. That's the downside to this road. People tend not to drive on one side of the road or the other. They drive down the middle of it. Because why would there ever be any traffic even though I'm driving on the road? Because, obviously this is somehow a one-way road, going whichever direction they want it to at the time. And yeah, this road gets rather foggy. So does the other way. It's all hills and valleys. Hills and valleys. Mornings, that tends to mean fog. Just be glad that it's still about a month away from the snow. The snow will be even more fun. For you, not for me. But yeah, even creating these, I gain copyright on them instantly. I generally am not a believer in the traditional copyright, which has, well, I shouldn't say the traditional. I'm okay with the old school version where it's a limited period of time. However, corporations, because they can outlive any human and they can see a revenue stream in anything, have basically said that copyright that was only like a decade long, roughly. In the U.S. originally copyright was, I believe, 12 or 14 years, which even now is a very long time. But that wasn't good enough for them. It's currently, I think, life of the author plus 50 years is currently what it is. Which basically means that if you're someone producing a work of art and it's going to be worth anything commercially, you do this in, say, like your 20s or 30s, it would not only provide for your offspring, but your offspring's offspring, and maybe even your offspring's offspring's offspring. So yeah, 3 generations of kids living on the original work of the now very long deceased person. I think that specifically is where things started to go wrong. The corporations couldn't get effectively eternal copyrights on them in their own hands. It's still tied to the life of the author, but corporations now own the copyrights more often than individuals do. The reason because of that is because most contracts have you assigning all the rights for your copyright to a corporation to get your work out there. Like, movies are usually done differently, but books and music, for instance, to actually get published, you usually have to assign the company that is publishing your work the copyright, which is why, like, inside the title of most books, you will clearly see that it's copyright whatever company is the printing company and publishing company for the work. I shouldn't even say printing company. Lots of publishers use printing companies that aren't in-house. But, yeah, the publisher is the one that's going to take the copyright on something. A few writers, because their earlier works were good enough, can keep, same for music, their copyrights to their own works, but most can't do that and get published with a large corporation. This is actually horrible for the individuals in most cases. There are bands, for instance, in the modern times that have signed a contract that says, like, for the next 4 albums that you produce, we'll own the copyright to it. Well, they put out the first album, they put out the second album, but between the first and the second album, the publisher notes that the popularity hasn't been as strong. The band comes out and creates a third album, and the publisher goes, "No, we don't like any of that. Come back with something else." But every time the band comes back to them, the publisher says, we don't really like that, come back with something else. And they do this over and over and over again. But see, that contract gave away their copyright for the next 4 albums that are actually published. So that band cannot publish anywhere else until they have actually gone and fulfilled their obligation to the company. Which usually forces bands to split up. I know of at least a dozen bands that have had that happen. And I know there's probably more examples than that, but it is all too common. This is true, too, of one-hit wonders. Popularity has faded off since the original work, and the publisher doesn't find any interest in doing anything except reprinting the ones that already made them lots of money. You know, they'd actually have to pay the band again, too, if they had put out a new album, and really, for them, it's probably not worth it. And that's skating around the whole royalties thing, and something like a band, the band should in some way have split up the royalty payments, but royalties are usually piddly little amounts of money. On a CD, it's often less than 5 cents of every CD that goes into the pockets of an actual person on the band. And sometimes that 5 cents is split up among the entire band, so everyone gets a penny. Yay! Seeing as how you have to at least sell 100 records that way, for anyone to have even made a single dollar off of recording sales, you can sort of see where this goes. One of the principles, specifically in the US version of copyright, is that we inherently created copyright so that it would spur the development of more works from authors. Because if they could make money off their work, they could afford to actually keep creating. However, this lifetime plus type of copyright gets rid of most of the incentive. I mean, sure, you can make more money, but if you have something like Lord of the Rings level, you would never have to work again. You could just create, say, a single novel, and if it was super, super popular, that's it, you're set. You don't gotta do anything else. You can get back, wait for the movie deal to come in, that sort of thing. And while it's nice that they get money in perpetuality, creative works are built on other creative works that have come before them. Disney is the specialist in this. Disney has taken classic stories like Cinderella, Mulan, Pocahontas, and that was a historical story even, but they've taken classic stories that already existed before Disney was even a thing, and they turn them into new works of art. But they're derived from old ones. Problem that comes into play here is that these new works of art, at least in their category, supersede everything else. See, like Disney, for instance, when they created their take on Snow White, any other Snow White movies that fall into, say, like the animated category, they basically sued out of existence. And there have actually been a couple of people that have tried to get like animated movies that also retell the same tale, but Disney has won most of the battles on such things. There's no requirement in copyright that they must go after anyone that infringes. Corporations could be nice about it and let us continue to build, but the knee-jerk reaction of most companies has been to sue everyone. Definitely true when the age of the MP3 came about and people started sharing music between each other as little MP3 files on the internet. That created the whole fiasco around things like Napster, with individuals getting sued for often billions of dollars when they hadn't made any profits off of sharing music with other people. Companies could have been nice about it, but that's not how they work. And since I'm now here, afraid that's going to be all for now. Take care and have fun, guys. I'll see you. Hello, everyone. It's that time again. I have two things that I plan to talk about. Once I manage to get out of the parking lot, at least. The first is to some mentally challenged people that nearly ran me over today. I've mentioned before that I bike up to a place I get lunch from every day. And today I was in their parking lot in my own lane, and a guy was coming up the other side of the road, and well, him and his friend were coming up the other side of the road, lane, whatever you want to talk about it as, and just before I reach where they are, they suddenly decide, without any warning, to swerve in front of me and pull into a parking spot. Of course, that means I have to swing wide to avoid running into them, or them running into me, depending on how that would actually end up. It depends on which of us got to that spot first, I guess. But they, of course, hadn't used a turn signal, and from the sheer laughter of the one in the passenger seat, because he apparently thought it was hilarious that the guy nearly ran me down. So, you really stupid jerks, you're now on the internet. Woo! I don't know who you are, but, yeah, that's where you've gotten. Of course, now everyone thinks you're an ass, but you've managed to get on the internet. You should be happy. Some people, it just boggles the mind. It really does. I don't know what sort of world they live in where they think that's a smart idea. Or even a good idea. And if I was a much worse person, I would have probably gone from fantasizing about slashing all their tires out and having them walk home to actually having done that. But I'm too good for that, in the sense that I might think about doing that sort of thing, but I would never actually do that sort of thing, even if it's fairly well deserved in this case. I think attempted vehicular manslaughter ought to have some punishment, because that seems to be what was on their mind. It's not like I'm on a motorcycle even, I'm just on a bicycle. If a car hit me, I would not be in too good shape. So yeah, there was that. And I just feel a need to get that out of my system. I'm thinking some of you might be able to understand that one. But that was the first thing I was going to bring up. The other thing is actually from last week, but I had forgotten it because it was on a day that I don't do my drive. And I had made a comment online about it, but I hadn't actually put it into one of my videos. I had meant to, but I forgot about the story before the next time I did one of these came up. The story, though, is about the new system that the financing companies have started to put in cars of people that they think have a decent chance of not meeting their monthly payments for their vehicle. They're, what do they call them specifically? I forget the name, but they're vehicle incapacitators. It's a little device that is plugged into the ignition system and can basically turn your vehicle off based on just a code that someone enters on the other end at the financing company. There's been dozens of cases about these now, because often even being as little as a day late causes them to disable your car because they can. One woman in particular that I recall basically had the story that she's a single mother who stopped working because her daughter that she was raising by herself had medical issues, and she was 3 whole days late on her payment for her car. Whether that was even just a it's in the mail thing, or if that was just a I haven't got my paycheck yet, or whatever sort of other check she might be getting. The story didn't specifically say, but yeah, her daughter has these medical problems, and entered into an emergency situation where she needed to get her daughter to the hospital immediately. But they had just before that decided to disable her car because she was 3 days late on the payment. So she can't take her daughter to the hospital. And I'm guessing there's some sort of indicator that tells her that the car has been disabled and that she needs to call the financing company. Because she did, in fact, call up the financing company to try to, get them to turn back on her car. And the response from the financing company was basically, oh, well, we can take care of that right now if you'll just provide us $383. And she's like, well, I don't have $383 right this minute, but I need to get my daughter to the hospital. And they're like, well, if you can just manage to pay us this $383, I can re-enable you right now. And basically they held her up for the $383 in an emergency situation. But there's been other reports of being stuck in very bad locations because people's cars just stopped working while they were driving them. At least one case of a guy on the freeway when the device cut out. And of course, it's all too common, especially if you're on a lower income budget, that you may be waiting 2 days before you get your next paycheck because it's not like you can work out an arrangement with a company that says like, well, I get paid every 2 weeks, so you need to make sure that there's at least 4 weeks and you manage to arrange your payment date so that it works when I actually get paid and can have the money for you. No, they don't do that. They just randomly seem to assign you a date. Of course, we all know how well that works. You can get a date that bears no resemblance whatsoever to when you actually have money available to pay it. I've had these problems before. Obviously, this car, being fairly old, is one that I've paid off, and it's been paid off for years now. But I am not afraid to say that a couple of times when I was paying for it, I didn't have the money right when they demanded it. Luckily for me, these devices weren't in use back then. And they don't seem to understand that most people need a car to be able to get to work, to be able to pay them. And if I can't get to work, I can't pay them. So it's quite a catch-22 conundrum there. But that doesn't seem to bother the financiers at all. And actually brings up something that I've meant to talk about before. Car companies, in some cases, have gone as far as to do things like buying up the LA subway system. And yes, you heard that right, LA once had a subway system. It was bought up in, I believe, the 60s, if I remember correctly, and then cemented in by the car companies that had purchased it. I don't remember exactly which ones, but basically, they didn't want silly mass transit getting in the way of their perfectly good plans. So, they had to buy up the mass transit. And since that big truck is going to turn, I'm going to go straight. So we'll take the detour. Because I don't really want to be behind the truck anymore. But car companies are in part why we don't have good mass transit options in the United States. I think I mentioned once about the crazy fact that trains that do in fact operate in two cities in the same state and have routes that would theoretically connect them can't actually be used by people because, that would be too hard. They have to be on different routes. I hate this sandpapery road. Can't wait until they actually fix the main one and I don't have to go a roundabout way every day. But they've gone out of their way to make having mass transit really hard to have, except in a few specific locations in most of the U.S. And they're not alone in that. There's all sorts. The oil industry, for one, certainly doesn't want any sort of mass transit options either, unless those options would happen to use oil products. Most smart ones these days don't. A few mass transit options are still like diesel engines and things, but for the most part, they are actually moving to or have been electric. At least all of the more modern ones that I've seen. Most subways are electric too because you can't really have any sort of fumes in a enclosed environment like a subway system tends to be. Well, you can have fumes, but those are a little bit dangerous to have, and you have to make sure to vent them properly. So doing it that way is not very efficient. Hence, most have been electric for a long time. But for most of the country, the only mass transit you might see in a big enough city is some sort of bus. And bus systems are pretty much notoriously bad. I haven't seen any that are reliable enough to be what I would consider good. The best ones I've seen vary the time that they get there by as much as 15 minutes. Which, if you need to be at a job, 15 minutes can be quite a lot. Come on, kittens. Oh. No hitting the cats. No hitting the cats. I didn't want that other one to cross in front of me when it did, but it was fast enough, so it all worked out. Completely lost my train of thought. That could be an advantage or a disadvantage to these being live and not in any way rehearsed or even possibly rehearsed. But yeah, a bus system, if it can vary by up to 15 minutes, especially if that's 15 minutes either way, it might be running faster, it might be running slow. That's easily half an hour out of your day wasted just waiting for a bus. And you have to go and plan for the route that is closest to you and leave well ahead of time, so that it doesn't affect it. Because the last time I lived in a city with a major bus system, and major bus system was pretty silly, since it only ran on 2 streets, making a big giant X through a town. Well, I shouldn't call it a town. It's a city in one of the 100 largest cities in the country. I don't remember the place position for it exactly on that list of top 100 by population. But I believe it's in 60th category, maybe. And it's second largest in its whole entire state. So not a small city by any means. But yeah, their bus routes, each bus ran up or down one of two roads going and meeting in the center of the town. I'm calling it a town, it's a city. But a city. Each stretch was 20 miles of busway. And that meant that you could run from one side to the other, and the whole stretch would be 40 miles in length, basically, which meant it went through most of the suburbs, though not all, that fell along that very path. But the city is 40 miles wide, roughly, not inclusively. I mean, that includes suburbs and a lot of other things through there. So the city proper is only a very small fraction of that, but including the suburbs makes up a much bigger area. But they don't do any side roads at all. If you lived in one of the corners that is not part of the X, you would have no bus system within any sort of reasonable walking distance. But that didn't bother anyone. Yeah, we don't have to cover those areas. We just need to go these two routes up and down these two streets. And that's all we need, obviously, because no one else ever would have to use these systems. Yeah, well, that doesn't work so well. That gives you big, huge traffic jams every day on all the streets, because people will go any other way using a car to get there, because a car is the only way to get around. In fact, that city was horrible about things like sidewalks. It was sometimes very hard within the city to find a sidewalk to walk on. Like, if you need to cross over the interstate, and the interstate followed a fairly similar X pattern going through the middle of the city, so if you wanted to get from one quarter of the city to the other, you would have to somehow cross the interstate. Well, there's no sidewalks at all. And cars are not very happy when you're walking in their road. Especially when they narrow it a lot for those stupid bridges. Of course, they don't really need to narrow it, but probably cuts down their construction costs if they can make a narrower bridge rather than a wider one. So they make a narrow bridge instead. But yeah, it was incredibly hard to get around. I didn't have a car when I first started living there. It was just god-awful to ever get anywhere. Which is why I made a huge concession and had to basically beg my parents to try to help me get a vehicle. I had roommates when I lived there, but my roommates were not what I would call reliable. In fact, reliable is sort of a joke. It was horrible. Part of that being the road situation. But now, especially since they put these in cars that are the poor part of America, and I have to say, America keeps getting poorer. I mean, there's a certain portion that are certainly not poor in any sense of the word, but what had economically been the middle class is no longer a middle class. Especially when you counter in inflation, the buying power of the people actually in that middle bracket that makes up the 5 traditional brackets of the economics world. There are 2 lower end brackets, 1 middle bracket, and then 2 higher end brackets. The bottom 3 have been getting less and less money for basically the same amount, if not more, labor for quite a long time now. I think, if I recall correctly, the current numbers are something like the lower, or lowest, I should say, section being down by about 8.3%. The second lowest being something like 6.4 maybe. It's been a while since I've seen the exact stat. And that middle class that we used to have being down about 1.6%. That may not seem like a lot to some people, but when you remember that the median income in the US is a whopping like $60,000, and the median income is slowly not being in the middle bracket anymore. It's just the top percent making so much money that it's actually pushing the median higher, even though that's not actually the bracket that most people fall in. That means people have been getting traditionally poorer. These days, to really be middle class and live a middle class life, you usually have to make at least $100,000, if not more, in a year. In my area, you can make a little bit less than that and live a middle class lifestyle because the cost of living is somewhat less. Not for like a lot of certain things, like internet access isn't going to be less here, that's for sure. But things like housing costs are relatively low compared to like a bigger city. Or a bigger area. It's kind of funny, actually. Once upon a time, when I was still making good money, and by good money I mean like, well, around $30,000. Actually, slightly more than that, but might as well call it $30,000, which for a single person isn't so bad. In this area. And if I was in a 2-income family, that probably would have been actually more like 60. And 60 would be perfectly fine to live around here. And do a lot of things that a a traditional middle class person would. But for most of the country, you usually need to make at least $100,000, and it's actually becoming more like $150,000 to live what would otherwise be properly called a middle class life, using the old school definition of such. You know, the picket fence house, that sort of thing, the 2 kids, the 2-car, well, 1.5 kids, I believe is what they said, for the classic middle class life. You know, the 2 cars, garage. You don't find many garages around here. But, yeah, to have that, you generally need to make much, much more than the average person in the U.S. makes these days. Which is actually why we're becoming a worse and worse market for companies. Companies want to start marketing to places like India or China because there are lots of people there who are gaining money, rivaling that of any person in the U.S. In fact, I may have brought this up before, but I once did the math on some reliable numbers for how much a Chinese worker gets paid and how much he spends on the basic necessities in any given month. And for that Chinese factory worker, they're making slightly more than minimum wage in the U.S. So if we were able to pay a factory worker minimum wage in the U.S., we'd be on par with China. But we always hear how China is so much cheaper. Well, a lot of that is the fact that you usually can't pay a factory worker minimum wage in the U.S. For a whole host of reasons. Usually you have to pay people more than minimum wage to get them to work in most factories, since factory work is pretty damn backbreaking. It's boring. Very few people in their right mind want to do it. So usually you have to pay more. But since the cost of living in especially rural China is so much lower than the US, minimum wage in the US and China is just way more than the equivalent in the US. Now, obviously, a lot of Chinese companies do things like providing all the food and shelter for their employees in like barracks style accommodations, and they kind of frown on you. And I hate when they're parked on the wrong side of the street. It makes me flinch for a second. I always think they're coming down the street in the wrong lane. It's happened. But yeah, they get a larger proportional part of their income they can spend even after the high prices that their employers charge them for things like housing, for barracks style accommodations. But it's not really the cesspool that a lot of places would make it out to be. And I'm gonna cut it off for there. So, have fun, and I'll see you tomorrow.